My uncle told everyone I was useless, so I let Grandma tell them what she really thought. I woke up that morning already tense, because I knew exactly what kind of day I was walking into. My family has this tradition of doing a late Saturday lunch at my aunt's place every few months, and even though I'm 32 now, I still get that same knot in my stomach every time I pull into their driveway. I'm Mark, by the way. I live just outside Columbus, Ohio, and I've spent most of my adult life trying to keep a healthy distance from the part of my family that seems to thrive on passive-aggressive comments and weird competition. But that morning, as I made coffee and tried to ignore the feeling creeping up my neck, I kept reminding myself that I had promised my cousin Jake I'd show up. He's one of the few relatives I still actually like, and he told me he needed someone in his corner today, though he didn't explain why. So I grabbed my jacket, locked up my apartment, and tried convincing myself that it would all be fine, even though history kept telling me otherwise. By the time I got to my aunt's house, the driveway was packed, and there was this cold wind whipping leaves around the front porch. Ohio winters aren't dramatic, but they're annoying, just cold enough to sting your face without actually snowing. When I stepped inside, I was hit with the smell of pot roast and some kind of overly sweet candle she insists on burning. The living room was already full of people, mostly sitting in that uncomfortable half-circle my family always forms when they're preparing for gossip. My Uncle Ron was planted near the center of it, already loud, already grinning like he owned the place. I felt his eyes land on me the second I walked in, that same look he's had since I was a kid, sizing me up, ready to poke at whatever insecurity he could find. I kept my head down, nodded politely to a few cousins, and made my way to the kitchen to help Jake put dishes out. Jake barely looked at me at first, just handed me a stack of plates and muttered something about how the day was going to be one for the books. He's younger than me by 4 years, but he's always been the one stuck in the middle of our family's nonsense. We worked in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the voices in the living room getting louder, until he finally leaned in and whispered that Ron had been talking trash about me all morning. Apparently, Ron had been telling anyone who'd listened that I'd never amounted to anything, and that I was just floating through life like a leaf in the gutter. It wasn't new. He's been calling me useless since I was 12. Still, hearing it again made my jaw clench so hard I felt it in my ear. I told Jake I didn't want trouble. He just nodded and said he understood, though I could see something in his face that didn't match the calm tone. Lunch got served. Everyone filled plates, and soon enough we were all crammed around the dining table or standing against the walls, balancing food on our laps. I tried keeping my focus on the pot roast, on the mashed potatoes, on anything other than the conversation that was starting to bend dangerously in my direction. You know that feeling when people don't say your name, but you can feel them talking about you? It was like static under my skin. My Aunt Diane kept glancing at me between bites, like she was waiting for something. My mom wasn't there. She lives in Florida now, and my dad's been gone for years, so I didn't have any buffer today. I swallowed hard, trying to play it cool, but then Ron cleared his throat dramatically, and that's when everything started sliding downhill. He started one of his "remember when" stories, the kind where he exaggerates something I did as a teenager to make me look stupid. This time it was about how I dropped out of a business program in my 20s because I realized I hated the field. In Ron's version, though, I quit because real work scared me. Everyone chuckled politely, that awkward laugh people use when they don't know whose side they're on. I felt my ears burning, and I forced a smile I didn't feel. I told myself to let it pass, but Ron wasn't finished. He launched into a whole monologue about how some people in this family grow up, get real jobs, take responsibility, and then he waved his fork toward me like a prop. And some people still don't know what the hell they're doing at 32. The room got uncomfortably quiet. Even the kids stopped moving. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, chewing slowly, staring down at my plate while trying to keep my breathing normal. I work in IT support at a regional company. It's not glamorous, but it's stable, and it's honest work. Most of them don't even understand what I do, but that hasn't stopped them from assuming it's beneath them. Ron especially. He's the kind of guy who thinks hourly jobs are evidence of moral failure. Jake whispered to ignore him, but I could feel this old anger building in my chest, the same kind I used to feel when Ron would corner me at family gatherings and tell me I'd end up living in my mom's basement forever. I gripped my fork harder than I meant to, feeling that tiny pulse in my thumb that always kicks up when I'm trying not to snap. Then, like clockwork, Ron started talking about Grandma. My grandma passed away 3 months ago, and her absence still hits me at weird moments. She was the one person in this family who made me feel like I mattered. But Ron always uses her memory as some kind of weapon. He went on about how she always wanted the grandkids to be hard-working, respectable adults. And he said it while looking right at me, like I was failing her by daring to exist. Something twisted in my gut. I didn't like how he used her like that, especially today, especially in front of everyone. I leaned back in my chair and stared at him, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, more like this cold clarity. While Ron kept going, I noticed something odd. On the counter behind him, next to the napkins and the extra serving spoons, there was an old floral envelope, the kind Grandma used when she mailed birthday cards. It was sitting there plain as day, with her handwriting on it, the looping cursive I'd recognize anywhere. My heart actually stumbled for a second. I nudged Jake and pointed with my chin. His eyes widened. He whispered that my aunt had found it when she was cleaning out some of Grandma's things last week, and everyone had been speculating about what was inside. They hadn't opened it yet because, according to Diane, it felt too personal. But she hadn't mentioned it to me, or Jake, or anyone who wasn't in her little circle. The more I looked at that envelope, the more I felt this quiet buzzing under my skin. I didn't reach for it right away. I just watched Ron talk, watched the way he gestured and smirked, watched how no one challenged him. I could feel myself starting to detach, like I wasn't even sitting in that chair anymore. Then, without really thinking, I set my plate on the side table, stood up, and walked over to the counter. The room immediately went still. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Even Ron shut up mid-sentence. I picked up the envelope, turning it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't heavy, but something about it felt final, like whatever was inside wasn't meant to stay hidden forever. My fingers were shaking a little, but I didn't care. I looked at my aunt and asked if she was saving this for something. She stammered, said she meant to give it to everyone later. It didn't sound convincing. When I opened it, it wasn't dramatic. The paper just tore quietly, and I slid out a single handwritten letter. It was dated 2 weeks before Grandma passed. I didn't read it out loud, at least not then. I just scanned the first few lines, and my throat tightened so fast I had to swallow twice. It was addressed to whoever needs to read this, and it was written in that straightforward, no-nonsense way Grandma always talked. I felt my eyes sting. I kept reading, feeling the whole room leaning toward me even though no one moved. When I got to the part with my name, my actual name written in her handwriting, I felt something inside me settle. Not soften, settle. I folded the letter slowly and looked around the room, letting the silence stretch just long enough that even Ron seemed unsure of himself. My chest felt warm, heavy but steady. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to be the scared kid in the corner anymore. I didn't read the whole thing out loud, not at first. I kept the letter in my hands, feeling the warmth of the room fade into the background as everyone stared at me like I was holding a live wire. Ron shifted in his chair, pretending he wasn't bothered, but he couldn't stop glancing between me and the envelope like he was waiting for his name to show up in some flattering way. I took a slow breath and read the next line silently, and that's when I realized exactly why my aunt had been waiting for the right moment. Grandma had written about how she worried the family had become too focused on image and expectations, how she felt some people were carrying unfair burdens while others judged from a distance. She mentioned Ron specifically, not by name, but in a way that made it painfully obvious who she meant. She wrote about how she hated seeing anyone in the family tear someone else down just to feel bigger. And then she wrote, very clearly, how proud she was of the person I'd grown into, even if others refused to see it. My chest tightened again, but this time it was more like relief than grief. I looked up from the letter, and the room was completely silent. You could hear the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen. A couple of the kids had even wandered in and were standing at the doorway, watching the adults freeze like statues. Ron looked annoyed, like this entire silence was personally offensive to him. Diane kept adjusting her napkin, even though it was already perfectly folded. Jake was staring straight at me, eyebrows lifted just enough to show that he understood exactly how heavy this moment was. I didn't know what to do at first. Part of me wanted to just hold the letter against my chest and walk out the door, call it a day. Another part of me wanted to read it word for word right there, with Ron 2 feet away, letting Grandma say what she could never say to him while she was alive. I didn't make a speech or anything. That's not who I am. Instead, I just read one part, the sentence where Grandma said, "Some people mistake quiet for weakness, but quiet often means someone has learned who is worth listening to." My hands trembled a little as I said it, but my voice didn't crack. When I looked up, Ron's jaw was tight enough to show from across the room. He tried to laugh, that fake dismissive laugh he uses when he's embarrassed, but it didn't land. No one joined him, not even his wife. I could see a couple cousins exchange looks, the kind that say everything without a single word. It hit me then that this wasn't just awkward for Ron. This was exposing something everyone already knew but never said out loud. Ron opened his mouth like he was going to defend himself, but nothing came out. Just this pathetic little scoff, like he couldn't believe Grandma had written anything that didn't worship him. He finally muttered something about how she was old and didn't know what she was saying near the end, which made something ugly twist in my stomach. You don't talk about Grandma like that. Not in front of me. Not ever. A couple relatives shifted uncomfortably, like they weren't expecting him to go that low. It made him look small, and he knew it, too. He kept glancing around like someone should jump in and rescue him, but nobody did. I didn't put the letter down. I kept it in my hand like a shield. I sat back in my chair while everyone else tried to pretend they weren't shaken, and I could feel this shift in the room. Subtle, but undeniable. The air felt heavier, the kind of heavy where people start rethinking the things they've said behind your back. My aunt cleared her throat and tried changing the subject, rambling about the weather, but nobody picked up the thread. People just stared at their food or the floor or the tablecloth like they needed something safe to focus on. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Grandma had done the talking for me. Minutes passed like that. Awkward, quiet, uncomfortable. Someone's fork clattered onto a plate, and it echoed way too loudly. Jake shot me a tiny smirk, the first sign of humor I'd seen from him all day, and it made me feel grounded again. Like I wasn't crazy for thinking Ron's behavior was toxic. Like I wasn't imagining the way people always brushed his cruelty off as just Ron being Ron. Today, nobody seemed interested in protecting his ego. For once, he was the one shrinking in his seat. Ron eventually tried to regain control of the room, leaning back and telling some story about work, but nobody was listening. You could see it in their faces. They weren't rude. They nodded when he paused, looked over politely, but the energy had shifted. His voice suddenly wasn't the loudest in the room anymore. Even the younger cousins seemed more interested in watching me than him. He noticed, too. His voice got sharper, his posture rigid. He kept glancing at me like I'd stolen something from him, like I had no right to interrupt the family hierarchy he'd built in his head. The tension made lunch drag on forever. People ate slowly, sipped water just to have something to do with their hands, occasionally murmured about needing to leave soon. I kept the letter folded neatly next to my plate, not hidden but not flaunted, just present enough that Ron kept staring at it like he wished he could burn it. Every so often, he'd mutter under his breath, just loud enough that I'd hear something like, "Doesn't prove anything," or "People romanticize the dead." I didn't react. I didn't even look his way. The more I ignored him, the more thrown off he seemed. Eventually, my aunt tried lightening the mood by bringing out a tray of dessert, store-bought pie that tasted like sugar and cardboard, but nobody really touched it. People started collecting coats, packing up leftover containers, giving awkward half-hugs. The whole gathering was unraveling faster than she could manage. I stayed seated for a bit, letting everyone move around me. Part of me was waiting to see if Ron would try confronting me once the crowd thinned. He usually does. But he didn't. He hovered near the doorway, arms crossed, looking like a kid who'd been told to stand in the corner. Every time someone walked past him, they avoided eye contact. When only about half the family remained, Ron finally mumbled something in my direction. Not an apology. Not even close. Just a bitter, "You think one letter suddenly makes you some kind of hero?" I didn't respond right away. I reached for the letter, slid it back into the floral envelope, and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Then I stood up and faced him, not aggressive, just steady. I told him, calmly, that I didn't need to be a hero, that I didn't even want to fight. I said the only thing that mattered was knowing what Grandma really thought. That, and not letting him rewrite her memory to suit his ego anymore. He stared at me with this mix of disbelief and anger, like he couldn't process how I'd slipped out from under his thumb. Jake walked over then, standing slightly behind me, and suddenly Ron didn't look so confident. For a second, He seemed like he wanted to say something else, something cruel, something sharp, but he just pressed his lips together and glanced away. I swear, you could feel the power dynamic in the room shift by a few inches. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real, quiet, like someone had finally cut the wire he'd been pulling on for years. But the real hit, the real moment everything changed, came a few minutes later when I was putting my boots on near the front door. My aunt approached me with this uneasy look, the kind she gets when she wants to scold someone but knows she doesn't have the moral high ground. She asked if she could see the letter. Just for a moment, she said, just so she could confirm something. Her voice was too careful, too forced. I held onto my boot and looked up at her slowly, taking in the tight smile and twitchy hands. Something clicked in my head. She didn't want to confirm anything. She wanted to read it before anyone else did. Or maybe hide it. Or maybe make sure something in it didn't make her look bad, too. I didn't hand her the letter. I just finished pulling on my boot and stood up, keeping my jacket zipped halfway so the envelope stayed tucked safely inside. She kept repeating the same question, trying to sound casual, but the edge in her voice gave her away. It wasn't curiosity. It was panic. I told her I needed more time with it, which was true, but that wasn't the only reason. The way she kept glancing toward Ron. Quick, nervous, like they'd already talked about whatever they thought was inside, made something settle heavily in my chest. For years, I'd assumed most of the family's weird behavior came from indifference or neglect. Standing there, watching her shift from foot to foot, I realized how much of it was actually fear. Not of me, of what Grandma might have written about them. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face so fast it made my eyes water. I wasn't crying. It was just that Ohio winter sting. But I needed that moment. The driveway was half empty now, and people were still lingering by their cars, pretending to dig through bags or scroll their phones so they didn't have to acknowledge the tension still hanging in the air. Jake walked out behind me and stood on the porch for a second, rubbing his hands together like he was working up the nerve to speak. He finally asked if I'd read the whole thing. I told him no, not yet. I said I wanted to do it alone, somewhere quiet. He nodded, like he understood in a way only someone who's been bruised by the same people could understand. Then he told me something that made my stomach twist. He'd overheard Diane whispering earlier that morning about how some letters are better left unread. It wasn't meant for him to hear, but he caught it anyway. I sat in my car for a long minute before turning the ignition. The inside smelled faintly like takeout from last night, and the heater blower made that low hum it always does before fully warming up. I pulled the envelope from my jacket and rested it on the passenger seat. It didn't look like much, just paper and ink, but the weight of it had changed everything in that house. I started to wonder how long they'd had it, how many days they spent speculating or worrying about what Grandma had written. The fact that none of them told me about it felt personal, like they didn't want me to know she'd thought kindly of me, or worse, that she'd thought poorly of them. I drove home slowly, more focused on the letter beside me than the traffic. When I finally got to my apartment, I tossed my keys on the counter, shrugged off my jacket, and sat at the small dining table where I eat most of my meals alone. The letter sat there in front of me again, and for a second I felt afraid to open it. Not because I expected anything bad, but because I knew it might change how I saw my family forever. I carefully unfolded the paper and smoothed out the creases. Her handwriting slanted slightly to the right, just like always. I started at the beginning this time, reading every single line slowly. She wrote about how she'd been thinking a lot near the end, trying to make sense of the people she loved and the people she wished she understood better. She wrote about feeling helpless watching certain family members tear others down. She wrote about regret, about wishing she'd spoken up more, about not wanting her death to turn into some kind of scoreboard where people tried to prove who mattered most to her. Then she shifted into something more personal. She wrote about me. She talked about being proud of how I'd rebuilt my life after making mistakes in my 20s, about how resilience is more valuable than appearances. She said I reminded her of her father, quiet, steady, misunderstood. I had to stop reading at one point because my throat got tight in a way I wasn't prepared for. But then she wrote something else, something that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the page for a long time. She said there were things the family avoids discussing, and that silence has cost people more than honesty ever did. She didn't list names. She didn't spell out secrets. But the tone shifted, like she wanted to say more and chose not to. She made a specific comment about how she hoped her belongings would go where they're needed, not where they're expected. My heart started thudding because that phrase, expected, felt suspiciously pointed. I'd seen how Ron hovered over her estate paperwork at the funeral like he was auditing a company he planned to take over. I'd seen Diane clutch her purse tighter every time anyone mentioned assets. She ended the letter with a line that stuck to me like glue. If they fight over pieces of me, remind them I was never a trophy to win. It was the kind of thing she would say when she was fed up with someone's ego. I folded the letter again, but this time more gently. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long minute, absorbing everything. I didn't know what this meant for whatever arguments might come later about her belongings. I didn't know why my aunt had wanted to check the letter. But I knew one thing clearly. Grandma had left that message for a reason. Not for them. For me. Later in the afternoon, after the sun dipped behind the buildings and the sky turned that dull winter gray, I got a text from Diane. It was short. Too short. She said she hoped I was doing okay, and that she wanted to talk about the letter when I had time. The message didn't sound concerned. It sounded strategic. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, Ron texted too. Something about not appreciating being ambushed. Ambushed. That's what he called me opening a letter addressed to the family. I stared at the message until the little bubble disappeared. Then I set my phone face down on the table. By evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that the letter had struck a nerve deeper than I realized. I knew this family well enough to recognize when they were scrambling. The way everyone acted today, the glances, the hesitation, the attempts to redirect, told me this wasn't just about Ron being cruel or Diane wanting control. It felt tangled. Like whatever Grandma had hinted at in those lines, things the family avoids discussing, might have been simmering for years. Maybe it had nothing to do with me. Maybe it had everything to do with them. But part of me wondered why they'd kept the letter away. Why they hadn't called me immediately when they found it. Why Diane had been so eager to confirm something. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if Grandma had written other letters too. She'd always been private. She loved writing things down, but she didn't always share what she wrote. It wasn't impossible that she'd tucked away messages for different people. Messages they might not want others to see. I kept replaying that moment in the kitchen when Diane looked at me like I'd opened a safe she'd been trying to break into for days. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. Sharp, immediate fear. Around 7, I made myself dinner, just a frozen lasagna, and ate it while staring at the folded envelope on the table. It felt wrong leaving it out in the open, so I eventually got up, walked to my bedroom, and slid it into a small wooden box I keep in my closet. It's where I store things that actually mean something. Photos, old birthday cards, a watch my dad gave me when I turned 19. I closed the lid carefully, like I was putting away something fragile. But right as I did, I felt this weird sensation wash over me. Not fear, not nostalgia, but a strange clarity. The kind that makes everything that happened earlier click into place. I realized that Grandma hadn't just defended me in that letter. She had exposed something without spelling it out. Something the others understood immediately, even if I didn't. And that's why they wanted control over the letter. That's why they didn't want me to have it. Because whatever was written between those lines, they'd recognized themselves in it. And they didn't like what they saw. That's when I remembered something from the gathering. Something small. Something I'd brushed off because the rest of the moment was so intense. When I first picked up the envelope, Diane's face had gone pale. Not surprised pale, but guilty pale. And Ron had shifted uncomfortably, almost reaching for the envelope before stopping himself. It wasn't normal. It wasn't how people react to a sentimental note. It was how people react when a secret is about to be dragged into the light. I walked back to the dining table and sat down again, staring at nothing for a moment. Then I reopened the letter, searching it for anything I might have missed. Any hint, any clue, anything that connected to their strange behavior. But it wasn't what was written that got me. It was what wasn't there. She never mentioned Diane once. Not once. In a letter addressed to the family. She mentioned me. She mentioned those who judge. She mentioned unspoken things. But no reference to the daughter who lived 5 minutes away and visited her constantly. Not even a thank you. Not even a memory. The absence felt intentional. The next morning, I woke up early, still thinking about that missing piece in the letter. I made coffee, sat back at the same dining table, and reread her words one last time. The silence around me felt different now. Not heavy, not sad, just clear. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I needed my family's approval to feel grounded. I didn't need to brace myself for their opinions or dodging their comments. Grandma's letter was the closest thing to closure I was ever going to get from that part of my life, and it was enough. More than enough. And the more I absorbed that, the more I understood that whatever secrets they were hiding, whatever guilt they feared the letter exposed, it wasn't my burden to carry. It never had been. By the afternoon, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I blocked both Ron and Diane's numbers. Not out of spite. Out of peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't need to be announced. I didn't send any angry messages. I didn't post anything online. I didn't confront them or threaten to expose whatever they were terrified of. I just removed myself from the line of fire. I kept the letter tucked away safely, not to use as ammunition, but as a reminder of someone who had seen me clearly even when the rest of the family chose not to. Jake texted me later saying he supported whatever decision I made and that he wanted to stay in touch more often. That message meant more to me than any fake apology from the others ever could. A couple of days later, Jake came by with a small box of things from Grandma's house. Photos, a sweater she used to wear, and a small tin of old buttons she collected. He said he thought she would have wanted me to have them. Diane had told him to donate or toss anything that didn't matter, but Jake grabbed these before they disappeared. Inside the box, under the sweaters and buttons, I found a small envelope with my name on it. A different handwriting. Older. It was a letter Grandma had written years ago. A shorter one. Just a few lines, talking about how she hoped one day I'd trust myself enough to stand up against people who try to shrink me. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but it wasn't sadness. It was something closer to gratitude. Holding that second letter, I finally understood the shape of the gift she had left me. It wasn't money. It wasn't property. It wasn't some dramatic secret to expose the rest of the family. It was something quieter and stronger. The ability to walk away without feeling like I'd lost anything. Her words had given me permission to let go. To stop trying to win a game that was rigged from the beginning. To choose the people who actually cared, like Jake, and leave the rest behind without guilt. I packed the 2 letters and the small box of her belongings into the wooden chest in my closet. When I closed the lid, I didn't feel a sense of finality. I felt direction. For once, I wasn't waiting for the next comment, the next jab, the next moment of humiliation disguised as family tradition. I didn't need to prove anything. Grandma had told me exactly who I was, and for the first time in my life, I believed her. I stood there in the quiet of my bedroom, took a slow breath, and realized that I'd finally won. Not by fighting them, not by exposing them, but by stepping out of their shadow entirely.